The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone walls of Jerusalem as young Solomon knelt before the ancient altar at Gibeon. The year was 970 BCE, and the weight of his father David's crown still felt foreign on his head. At 20 years old, he had inherited not just a kingdom, but the expectations of a nation that had seen their greatest king fall to his knees in repentance. "Lord God of my father David," Solomon whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the sacrificial fire, "I am but a child who knows not how to go out or come in. Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and bad." The smoke from 1,000 burnt offerings spiraled upward into the cloudless sky, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a young king who understood the magnitude of his responsibility. Around him, priests moved in practiced silence, their linen garments rustling softly as they tended to the sacred flames. That night, as Solomon lay on his simple bed in the royal tent, exhaustion finally claiming his racing mind, something extraordinary happened. In his dream, a presence filled the space around him, not visible but undeniably real, like the feeling of being watched by someone who loved you completely. "Ask what I shall give you." The voice resonated through his consciousness, warm yet infinitely powerful. Solomon's dream self trembled. Here was the opportunity every man secretly craved: unlimited wishes from the creator of the universe. Wealth beyond imagination, military might to crush any enemy, a lifespan that would make him legendary. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the faces of his people flashed before him. The widow struggling to feed her children, the merchant cheated by corrupt judges, the farmer whose land had been seized by the powerful. "Give me wisdom to lead your people justly," he heard himself say, surprised by his own words. The presence seemed to smile, though Solomon could see nothing. "Because you have asked for wisdom, rather than riches or long life or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you have not asked for as well. You shall have both riches and honor, and no king shall compare to you." Solomon woke with the dream burning in his memory like a brand. As he emerged from his tent, the first light of dawn was painting the hills of Judah in shades of gold and amber. Something had changed in the night. He could feel it in the way his mind worked, processing information with startling clarity, seeing patterns and connections that had been invisible before. Within months, the transformation was evident to everyone. Merchants came from distant lands, not just to trade, but to witness the legendary wisdom of Israel's king. They brought impossible disputes, two women claiming the same baby, boundary disagreements that had festered for generations, questions of law that had puzzled scholars for decades. "Bring me a sword," Solomon commanded during one famous case, his voice echoing through the marble halls of his judgment chamber. The two women before him, one cradling a living infant, the other weeping over a dead child, watched in horror as a guard approached with a gleaming blade. "We will cut the living child in two," Solomon announced, his face impassive. "Each woman shall receive half." "Yes, my lord," said one woman quickly. "Let it be neither mine nor hers, but divide it." "No!" cried the other, falling to her knees. "Give her the living child. Do not kill it." Solomon's stern expression melted into a gentle smile. "Give the living child to the second woman. She is its mother." The crowd that had gathered to witness the judgment erupted in amazed murmurs. This was not just clever reasoning, this was supernatural insight into the human heart. As word of such judgment spread, caravans began arriving from across the known world. Egyptian nobles, Mesopotamian merchants, and Ethiopian princes all came to Jerusalem, their camels laden with gifts and their minds full of questions. The city transformed from a modest mountain stronghold into a cosmopolitan hub where languages mingled in the marketplaces and foreign customs blended with Hebrew traditions. But with the visitors came something else, influences that would, in time, prove far more dangerous than any enemy army. In the glittering eyes of foreign princesses and the exotic rituals of distant lands, seeds of temptation were being planted in the fertile soil of unlimited power and growing pride. Solomon stands on the roof of his palace, looking out over a Jerusalem that grows more magnificent each day. The wisdom that had been his greatest blessing was attracting not just admiration, but desires and temptations that would test the very foundation of his faith. The young king, who had once asked only for wisdom to serve his people, was beginning to discover that every gift from heaven carries with it the potential for earthly corruption. 7 years had passed since that pivotal dream at Gibeon, and Jerusalem had transformed into something that defied the imagination of previous generations. The sound of hammers on stone, the creaking of cedar beams being hoisted into place, and the voices of craftsmen from a dozen nations had become the constant soundtrack of the holy city. Solomon stood before the nearly completed temple, his hands behind his back, watching as the final golden cherubim were carefully positioned above the Ark of the Covenant. The morning light, streaming through the high windows, caught the intricate carvings on the olive wood doors, each detail representing months of painstaking work by master artisans from Tyre. "It is magnificent, my king," said Hiram, the chief craftsman from Phoenicia, his weathered face beaming with pride. "Never has bronze been cast with such precision, never have stones been fitted with such perfection." Solomon nodded slowly, but his expression was troubled. The temple was indeed magnificent, its walls overlaid with pure gold, its courts paved with the finest marble, its furnishings crafted from materials gathered from the ends of the earth. But the cost had been staggering, not just in gold and silver, but in human labor. "Adoniram," Solomon called to his minister of forced labor, a thin man with calculating eyes who had proven ruthlessly efficient at organizing the massive workforce required for the construction projects. "Yes, my king. How many men are working the quarries this month?" 30,000 Israelites rotating in shifts of 10,000, my lord, plus the permanent force of 70,000 Canaanite carriers and 80,000 hewers in the mountains. The numbers rolled off Adoniram's tongue with casual precision, but Solomon felt a weight settling on his chest. These weren't just statistics, they were fathers torn from their families, young men whose backs were bent under the burden of his ambitions. Yet, when he looked at the temple rising before him, doubts seemed to evaporate like morning mist. This was for God's glory, wasn't it? The Lord himself had chosen David to desire a house for his name, and Solomon to build it. Surely the temporary hardship of his people was justified by the eternal glory they were creating. The dedication ceremony arrived with the autumn rains. Kings and queens from across the known world gathered in Jerusalem, their retinues filling every available space in the city. The Queen of Sheba had traveled for months across desert and mountain to witness this moment, her caravans stretching for miles and laden with spices, gold, and precious stones. As Solomon prepared to enter the temple's holy place, the weight of the moment settled upon him. This was the culmination of everything: the dream, the wisdom, the years of planning and building. He had created something that would stand as a testament to God's glory for generations to come. The ceremony itself was overwhelming in its splendor. 22,000 cattle and 120,000 sheep were sacrificed, the smoke of the offerings rising like incense to heaven. The sound of trumpets and cymbals filled the air, mingling with the voices of the Levitical choir in harmonies that seemed to make the very stones of the temple sing. But it was when Solomon knelt before the altar, spreading his hands toward heaven, that the true power of the moment revealed itself. "Lord God of Israel," his voice carried across the vast crowd, "there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing mercy to your servants who walk before you with all their heart." As he prayed, clouds began to gather overhead despite the clear morning sky. By the time he reached the climax of his prayer, "Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Darkness had covered the sun. Then it happened. A cloud, thick and luminous, descended upon the temple. The priests could not continue their service because the glory of the Lord filled the house. The entire assembly fell prostrate, their faces pressed to the stone pavement, overwhelmed by the tangible presence of the divine. Solomon himself was overcome, tears streaming down his face as he felt the approval of heaven settling upon his work like a blessing. In that moment, all the sacrifices, all the labor, all the cost seemed not just justified, but insignificant compared to what had been accomplished. But even in that pinnacle moment of spiritual triumph, the seeds of future trouble were already germinating. Among the foreign dignitaries watching the ceremony were princesses whose beauty had not escaped Solomon's notice, ambassadors whose exotic customs intrigued him, and merchants whose tales of distant lands and different gods stirred something restless in his increasingly sophisticated heart. The Queen of Sheba approached him after the ceremony, her dark eyes reflecting both admiration and something more complex. A recognition of power that matched her own, an intelligence that could engage with hers as an equal. "The report I heard in my own land of your acts and your wisdom was true," she said, her voice carrying the musical accent of the African kingdoms. "But I did not believe the words until I came and my own eyes had seen it. Indeed, the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame I heard." As she spoke, Solomon found himself studying not just her words, but her face, her gestures, the way she carried herself with the confidence of a woman accustomed to ruling. Here was someone who could understand the burden of kingship, the isolation of ultimate responsibility. "Your servants are happy, and your people are happy, who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom," she continued. "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, to set you on the throne of Israel." The flattery was intoxicating, especially coming from someone whose own reputation for wisdom was legendary throughout the ancient world. As Solomon showed her through his palace, his gardens, his stables filled with horses from Egypt and chariots overlaid with gold, he saw his achievements reflected in her impressed expression and felt a pride that went beyond mere satisfaction in work well done. Solomon standing on the highest point of his palace at sunset, the completed temple glowing in the golden light, the visiting dignitaries dining in his halls, and the sounds of prosperity echoing through the streets of Jerusalem. He had built wonders that would be remembered for millennia, had created a center of learning and trade that drew the greatest minds of the age. But in the growing shadows of evening, questions lingered. The forced labor that had built his marvels was causing murmurs among his people. The foreign influences flooding into Jerusalem were bringing new ideas, new customs, and new temptations. And deep in his heart, Solomon was beginning to discover that even divine wisdom could not fully protect a man from the intoxicating allure of his own success. The palace gardens bloomed with flowers from every corner of the known world, roses from Damascus, lilies from the valleys of Lebanon, exotic blooms shipped in carefully tended containers from the kingdoms of Africa and Asia. As Solomon walked the paved pathways in the cool of the evening, the mingled fragrances created an almost intoxicating atmosphere, much like the court he had built around himself. 20 years had passed since the temple's dedication, and Jerusalem had become the most cosmopolitan city in the ancient world. But nowhere was this transformation more evident than in the women's quarters of the palace, where 700 wives and 300 concubines from every nation had turned what was once a simple royal residence into a complex web of cultures, languages, and competing loyalties. "My king," came a soft voice behind him. Solomon turned to see Naamah the Ammonite, one of his earlier wives and the mother of his son Rehoboam. Her beauty had matured over the years, but her eyes held a sadness that had grown deeper with each new addition to his collection of wives. "The princess from Moab has arrived," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "She brings greetings from her father and gifts for the marriage ceremony." Solomon nodded, his mind already calculating the political advantages of this new alliance. Moab controlled crucial trade routes to the east, and their friendship would secure Israel's borders while opening new opportunities for commerce. It was practical, necessary even, but as he looked at Naamah's resigned expression, something twisted in his chest. When had he stopped seeing these women as individuals and begun viewing them merely as political instruments? "And how is Rehoboam progressing in his studies?" he asked, attempting to bridge the growing distance between them. "He is bright, like his father," Naamah replied, but there was no warmth in the compliment, though he asks why he sees so little of the wisest king in the world. The rebuke, gentle as it was, stung more than Solomon cared to admit. He had become a stranger in his own household, moving from wife to wife, from political alliance to political alliance, collecting relationships the way other men collected precious stones. That evening's marriage ceremony was magnificent, as all such occasions had become in Solomon's court. The Moabite princess, barely 16 and trembling with a mixture of excitement and terror, was adorned in silks and jewels that represented the combined craftsmanship of a dozen nations. The celebration feast featured delicacies from across the empire: honey from the hills of Canaan, spices from Arabia, wine from the finest vineyards of the Mediterranean. But it was during the ceremony itself that Solomon noticed something that should have alarmed him more than it did. As part of the traditional Moabite rituals, the princess's attendants had brought with them small figurines, household gods that were meant to ensure fertility and protection in her new home. "These cannot remain in the palace." Benaiah, his captain of the guard and one of his father David's old companions, whispered urgently in Solomon's ear. "They are idols, forbidden by the law." Solomon looked at the small bronze figurines, no larger than his hand, their crude features meant to represent various Moabite deities. They seemed so harmless, so insignificant compared to the magnificent temple he had built for the Lord. Surely allowing a young girl to keep a few mementos of her homeland was a small concession to make for such significant political gains. "Let her keep them," he murmured back to Benaiah. "They are not for worship, merely comfort items for a girl far from home." The older man's expression grew troubled, but he said nothing more. Solomon noticed, though, that several of his father's old advisors exchanged meaningful glances, the kind of looks that spoke of shared concerns and growing alarm. As months turned to years, the pattern repeated itself with each new marriage. Egyptian princesses brought their worship of Ra and Isis. Sidonian nobles introduced the sensual rituals of Ashtoreth, and Hittite royalty carried with them the ancient practices of their mountain gods. Each time, Solomon justified the small compromises as diplomatic necessities, cultural sensitivities, political wisdom. But the small compromises had a way of becoming larger ones. "My lord," said Zabud, Solomon's priest and trusted friend from childhood, entering the king's private study where Solomon was reviewing trade agreements. "I must speak with you about the reports I'm receiving from the priests." Solomon looked up from his scrolls, noting the deep concern etched on his friend's face. "What troubles you, old friend?" "The women's quarters, my king. There are altars being built, incense being burned to foreign gods. Some of your wives are conducting rituals that—" Zabud hesitated, clearly struggling with how to express what he had witnessed. "That what?" Solomon's voice carried a sharp edge. "Rituals that would horrify your father. Rituals that violate everything the temple represents." Solomon set down his reed pen, irritation flashing in his eyes. "These women are far from their homelands, Zabud. They find comfort in familiar practices. It harms no one." "It harms you, my king," Zabud's voice rose with uncharacteristic passion. "It harms your relationship with the Lord who gave you everything you possess. Can you not see how you are being drawn away, step by small step?" The rebuke hit its target, but instead of repentance, it triggered defensiveness. Solomon stood, his full height and royal bearing suddenly intimidating even to his childhood friend. "Are you questioning my wisdom, priest, the wisdom that God himself gave to me?" Zabud visibly flinched, but pressed on. "I question whether that wisdom is being clouded by other influences." For a moment, the two men stared at each other across a chasm that had been growing for years. Solomon saw in his friend's eyes the same look he had been noticing in more and more of his advisors: disappointment, concern, and something that looked dangerously like pity. "Leave me," Solomon said quietly, but his tone brooked no argument. After Zabud departed, Solomon walked to his window overlooking the temple. Even now, smoke rose from the evening sacrifice, and the sound of Levitical chants drifted across the courtyards. It was all still there, the worship, the rituals, the forms of devotion that had defined his kingdom. But as he watched, he became aware of other sounds: the tinkling of bells from the women's quarters where foreign rituals were being performed, the chanting in unfamiliar languages, the smoke of different incense rising from hidden altars throughout his palace complex. When had it become so complicated? When had serving God stopped feeling like enough? That night, unable to sleep, Solomon made his way through the palace corridors to a small chamber he rarely visited, a simple room that had belonged to his father David, left untouched since the old king's death. Here David's harp still leaned against the wall, his simple wooden prayer bench faced toward Jerusalem's original altar, and his personal scrolls of the law lay open to passages worn smooth by countless readings. Solomon sat on his father's bench and tried to pray, but the words felt hollow in his mouth. How could he ask for guidance when he was no longer sure he wanted to hear the answer? How could he seek God's will when he had grown so accustomed to having his own way in everything? Solomon sitting in his father's prayer room as dawn breaks over Jerusalem. Through the window he can see the temple he built, still magnificent, still the center of proper worship for his people. But he can also see the smoke rising from 100 different altars throughout his palace complex, each representing a small compromise, a gradual step away from the single-minded devotion that had once defined his kingdom. The collector of hearts had amassed the greatest collection in human history, but in doing so, he was discovering that his own heart was becoming divided, scattered among so many influences and desires that he was losing sight of the simple truth that had once guided him, that wisdom without devotion is merely clever foolishness, and that a man can gain the whole world and still lose the most essential part of himself. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy incense smoke that now perpetually hung over the Mount of Olives. What had once been a peaceful hillside overlooking Jerusalem had been transformed into something that would have been unrecognizable to Solomon's father, a complex of altars, shrines, and ritual sites dedicated to gods whose names David would never have allowed to be spoken in his presence. Solomon, now 55 years old, stood before the newest addition to this collection, a massive bronze statue of Moloch, the Ammonite god whose worship required the most horrible of sacrifices. The statue's arms were designed to heat red-hot, its gaping mouth crafted to receive offerings that Solomon tried not to think about too directly. "It is impressive, my lord," said Rezin, the Syrian prince who had become one of Solomon's closest advisors and one of his most dangerous influences. "My wife says her people will finally feel welcomed in your kingdom now that their God has a proper dwelling." Solomon nodded absently, but his mind was elsewhere. The construction of this particular altar had required him to cross a line he had never imagined he would approach. Not personally, of course. He told himself he would never participate in the more extreme rituals associated with Moloch worship. But providing a place for such worship, sanctioning it with royal approval, that was different. That was just diplomacy. "The kingdom prospers under your wisdom," Rezin continued, his voice smooth as honey. "Trade routes secure, borders peaceful, treasuries full. Surely this proves that the gods smile on your reign, regardless of which particular deity receives honor on any given day." The logic was seductive, and Solomon had heard variations of it from dozens of advisors over the years. His kingdom was indeed prosperous beyond imagination. Gold flowed in from Ophir, spices from Arabia, ivory and exotic animals from Africa. His navy controlled the seas, his merchant caravans dominated the overland routes, and his diplomatic marriages had created a web of alliances that made Israel effectively unconquerable. If this was divine disapproval, it was certainly well disguised. But even as Solomon reassured himself with these thoughts, a commotion from the city below caught his attention. A crowd was gathering near the temple, and even at this distance he could see the agitated gestures of the people and hear the rise and fall of angry voices. "What troubles them now?" Solomon muttered, his patience with his subjects' concerns wearing increasingly thin over the years. Within the hour, a delegation of tribal elders had requested an audience, demanded it really, though they couched their words in the proper forms of respect. Solomon received them in his throne room, noting how their eyes avoided looking directly at him, how their usual deference seemed strained. Ahijah the Shilonite stepped forward as their spokesman, the elderly prophet's presence lending weight to whatever complaint they had brought. Solomon's heart sank slightly. Ahijah was one of the few men left from his father's generation who still spoke with the moral authority of the Old Covenant. "My king," Ahijah began, his voice carrying the tremor of age but none of its uncertainty, "we come to you with heavy hearts and urgent concerns." "Speak freely," Solomon replied, though his tone suggested anything but freedom. "The people are troubled by what they see on the Mount of Olives. Altars to foreign gods within sight of the temple, rituals being performed that violate everything our fathers died to establish in this land." Solomon felt the familiar flash of irritation. "These altars serve diplomatic purposes. They demonstrate our kingdom's tolerance and sophistication, our ability to work with all nations rather than isolating ourselves in narrow-minded. They demonstrate our king's abandonment of the covenant that brought us to this land." The words erupted from Ahijah with prophetic force, cutting through Solomon's explanation like a sword through silk. The throne room fell silent. No one had spoken to Solomon in such direct terms for years. His advisors, his wives, his officials, all had learned to approach him with the careful deference due to a man whose wisdom was legendary and whose power was absolute. "Furthermore," Ahijah continued, his eyes now blazing with conviction, "the people cry out under the burden of your building projects. Fathers are torn from their families for months at a time, sons conscripted into labor gangs, taxes raised beyond what the land can bear. The peace and prosperity you claim comes at a price that grows heavier each year." Solomon's face flushed with anger. "Everything I have built has been for the glory of this kingdom and the honor of which God, my king?" Ahijah's question stopped Solomon mid-sentence. "The Lord who gave you wisdom and made you great, or the collection of false deities whose altars now pollute the holy city?" For a moment, Solomon felt something like his old self stirring, the young king who had asked only for wisdom to serve his people faithfully. But that feeling was quickly overwhelmed by a surge of wounded pride and defensive anger. "You forget yourself, old man," he said quietly, his voice carrying a menace that made several of the elders step back. "I am the king God chose, the builder of his temple, the wisest ruler who has ever lived. Are you suggesting that your understanding surpasses mine?" Ahijah's expression grew infinitely sad. "I am suggesting, my king, that wisdom without obedience is merely clever rebellion, and that the Lord who gave you everything you possess can take it away just as easily." The prophet's words hung in the air like a curse. Solomon felt something cold settle in his chest, a premonition that he quickly suppressed with anger. "Leave my presence," he commanded, his voice echoing through the marble halls, "all of you, and do not return with such complaints again." As the delegation filed out, Solomon noticed that Ahijah was the last to leave. The old prophet turned at the threshold and looked back with eyes full of both sorrow and certainty. "The Lord has already spoken concerning your house, O Solomon. What has been spoken will surely come to pass." That night, alone in his chambers, Solomon tried to recapture the peace he had once known in prayer. But when he knelt facing toward the temple, his mind was filled with images of the altars on the Mount of Olives. When he attempted to recall the psalms his father had taught him, he heard instead the exotic chants from his wives' quarters. When he sought the simple certainty of his youth, he found only the complex justifications of his middle age. The dream, when it came, was unlike the gentle visitation of his youth. This time, the presence that filled his sleeping mind carried judgment rather than blessing, disappointment rather than approval. "Because you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. However, I will not do it in your days for the sake of David your father, but I will tear it from the hand of your son." Solomon woke with tears on his cheeks and terror in his heart. But even as the dream's impact shook him, part of his mind was already working to minimize its significance, to explain it away as anxiety rather than divine communication. Solomon, standing at his window as the sun rises over a Jerusalem that appears as magnificent as ever. The temple still gleams with gold. The palace still bustles with activity. The trade caravans still bring wealth from across the known world. But shadows are growing longer, and the king who once asked only for wisdom to serve God faithfully has become a man who can no longer distinguish between serving God and serving his own increasingly complex desires. The darkness that was always possible in the human heart has begun to eclipse the light of divine wisdom. And Solomon is discovering that even the wisest man who ever lived is not immune to the gradual corruption that comes from believing his own success proves God's approval, regardless of how far he has strayed from God's actual will. 39 years had passed since that young king had knelt at Gibeon and asked for wisdom to lead God's people. Now Solomon sat hunched on his throne. His legendary beauty faded, his once clear eyes clouded with the weight of accumulated choices. The wisdom that had made him famous throughout the world remained, but it had become a cruel gift, sharp enough to see exactly how far he had fallen, yet apparently powerless to lift him back up. The throne room that had once hosted the greatest minds of the ancient world now felt hollow and cold. Many of his wisest advisers had died or withdrawn from court, unwilling to watch their king's continued descent. Those who remained were either too frightened to speak honestly or too corrupted themselves to see clearly. "My king," announced the herald, "Jeroboam son of Nebat requests an audience." Solomon looked up with interest despite himself. Jeroboam was one of his most capable administrators. A young man, he had personally elevated from obscurity to oversee the labor forces of the northern tribes. If anyone could understand the complexities of governance, surely it would be someone who had seen the system from both sides. Jeroboam entered with proper deference, but Solomon's keen eye, still sharp despite everything, detected something different in the young man's bearing. There was a tension, a barely contained energy that spoke of a man wrestling with momentous decisions. "Speak," Solomon commanded, his voice carrying none of the warmth it had once held for promising young leaders. "My king, I come to you with concerns about the northern tribes. The burden of forced labor grows heavier each year, and the people—" Jeroboam hesitated, clearly struggling with how to express dangerous truths to a king who had grown intolerant of criticism. "The people what?" Solomon's tone was dangerously quiet. "They speak of rebellion, my lord. Not openly, not yet, but in whispers around cooking fires and in the fields during rest periods. They remember the days when Israel was united by covenant rather than by compulsion. The words hit their target. It's hit. Solomon felt the familiar flash of anger, but underneath it something deeper and more disturbing. The recognition that he had heard similar warnings from others, warnings he had chosen to ignore or suppress. "And what would you have me do, Jeroboam? Release the workers, halt the building projects, allow the kingdom to stagnate while our neighbors grow strong?" "I would have you remember what made Israel great," Jeroboam replied, his voice growing bolder. "Not magnificent buildings or foreign alliances or diplomatic marriages, but the covenant with the God who brought us out of Egypt." The reference to the covenant struck Solomon like a physical blow. How long had it been since anyone had dared speak so directly about his spiritual condition? How long since he had allowed such a conversation? "You presume much, young man," Solomon said, rising from his throne. "Who are you to lecture the wisest king who has ever ruled?" But even as he spoke the familiar words, Solomon heard how hollow they sounded. The wisdom that had once been a gift from heaven had become a source of pride, a weapon to silence critics rather than a tool to serve others. Jeroboam straightened, and for a moment his deferential mask slipped entirely. "I am someone who still remembers what it means to serve the Lord, rather than merely using his name to justify what we wanted to do anyway." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a burnt offering. Solomon felt something break inside him, not his pride, which remained as strong as ever, but something deeper. The last connection to the young king who had once cared more about God's approval than his own glory. "Leave," Solomon whispered, his voice barely audible. "Leave now, before I do something we will both regret." After Jeroboam departed, Solomon found himself alone with thoughts he had been avoiding for years. He walked slowly through his palace, seeing it now through different eyes. The magnificent halls filled with tribute from every nation, the courtyards where foreign wives conducted their exotic rituals, the balconies overlooking a Jerusalem that had become more Babylonian than Hebrew in its customs and concerns. He made his way to the temple, hoping that proximity to the place where God's glory had once visibly dwelled might rekindle something of his former devotion. But even here, the sight of the altar, where proper sacrifices were still offered, could not drive away the knowledge of what was happening just across the valley on the Mount of Olives. That evening, as he had done so many times in recent years, Solomon attempted to write. The proverbs that had once flowed from his inspired mind now came haltingly, and too often they reflected his own spiritual condition rather than divine wisdom. "There is a way that seems right to a man," he wrote, his hand trembling slightly, "but its end is the way of death." The irony was not lost on him. He was writing about the very trap he had fallen into, the gradual substitution of human reasoning for divine guidance, the slow drift from serving God to serving self while maintaining the appearance of spirituality. Better is a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who will no longer take advice. The words stung as he wrote them, a recognition that he had become the very thing he had once been wise enough to warn against. As the months passed, the signs of divine displeasure became impossible to ignore. Hadad the Edomite, whom Solomon had allowed to live in Egypt, began stirring up trouble in the south. Rezon of Damascus, once a trusted ally, was forming coalitions against Israel's interests, and closer to home, the northern tribes grew increasingly restless under their burden of forced labor and heavy taxation. But it was the encounter with Ahijah the Shilonite that finally shattered Solomon's remaining illusions about his spiritual condition. The old prophet intercepted Jeroboam on a road outside Jerusalem, and what happened there would change the course of Israel's history forever. When Solomon learned that Ahijah had torn his own garment into 12 pieces, giving 10 to Jeroboam as a prophetic sign that he would rule over 10 tribes of Israel, the king's world began to collapse. The dream of his youth returned to haunt him, but now its terrible fulfillment was beginning. The kingdom would be torn apart, not by external enemies, but by the internal rot of spiritual compromise and oppressive governance. In his private chambers, away from the eyes of courtiers and the demands of kingship, Solomon finally faced the magnitude of what he had lost. The wisdom remained. He could still see clearly, still analyze and understand with supernatural insight. But wisdom without obedience had become a curse rather than a blessing, allowing him to see exactly how thoroughly he had destroyed everything that had once made him great. "Vanity of vanities," he whispered to the empty room, beginning to formulate thoughts that would later become his most personal book. All is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? The man who had once been given everything, wisdom, wealth, honor, peace, was discovering that none of these gifts could survive the slow poison of spiritual compromise. The gradual substitution of political pragmatism for covenant faithfulness, the incremental acceptance of practices that would have horrified his younger self, the growing isolation from anyone who might speak truth to power, all of it had led to this moment of terrible clarity. Solomon alone in his father David's old prayer room, the same space where he had once struggled to pray as his heart was being divided. Now, in the twilight of his reign, he knelt again on his father's simple wooden bench and wept, not just for what he had become, but for what he had lost. The wisest man who ever lived had discovered that wisdom without righteousness is merely sophisticated foolishness, that success without faithfulness is ultimately failure, and that a man can gain the entire world while losing his own soul. Outside, Jerusalem continued its bustling life, unaware that their golden age was drawing to a close. The temple still gleamed in the setting sun. The merchant caravans still brought wealth from distant lands, and the kingdom still appeared as strong as ever. But Solomon knew what his subjects did not yet understand, that the foundations had been rotting from within, and that the collapse, when it came, would be as swift as it was inevitable. The young king, who had once asked only for wisdom to serve God faithfully, had become an old king who finally understood that all his accumulated wisdom, wealth, and power meant nothing if he had lost the simple trust that had made it all possible in the first place. The darkness he had allowed into his heart had not overcome the light gradually. It had done so one small compromise at a time, until the man who had once been called beloved of God could barely remember what that love had felt like. As the first stars appeared over Jerusalem, Solomon remained kneeling in his father's prayer room, finally understanding that the greatest tragedy of his life was not what he had become, but what he had chosen to stop being. The wisest man in the world had lost himself in the darkness of his own success, and all his legendary wisdom could not show him the way back to the light he had abandoned one choice at a time. The kingdom that had reached its greatest heights under his rule would not survive his spiritual failure intact. Within a generation, the united monarchy his father had built would be split forever, and the glory of Israel would become a memory preserved in the writings of prophets who would spend centuries calling the people back to the covenant their wisest king had gradually abandoned. In the end, Solomon's greatest legacy would not be the temple he built or the wisdom he displayed, but the cautionary tale he became, proof that even the most blessed among men can fall when they begin to trust in their own understanding rather than walking humbly with their God. Epilogue: The lesson of the fallen king. The scribes who recorded Solomon's final words noted that his last written work was unlike anything he had produced before. Gone were the confident aphorisms about wisdom and success, replaced by haunting reflections on the meaninglessness of achievement without divine purpose. "I have seen all the works that are done under the sun," he wrote, "and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind." These were not the words of a man who had lost his wisdom, but of one who had finally learned to use it properly, to see clearly the emptiness of everything he had pursued instead of God. The tragedy was that this clarity came too late to save his kingdom, too late to undo the damage of decades of spiritual compromise. Solomon's story serves as an eternal warning that no amount of divine blessing can protect a heart that gradually turns away from its source. The man who asked for wisdom to serve God faithfully became the man who used that wisdom to justify serving himself, and in doing so, he lost both his kingdom and his peace. The wisest man who ever lived had learned in the end that wisdom's greatest lesson is the simplest one: to fear the Lord and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Everything else, no matter how magnificent it might appear, is merely vanity and grasping for the wind. His kingdom would be divided, his glory would fade, and his name would be remembered as much for his failures as for his achievements. But perhaps that too was a kind of wisdom, the hard-won understanding that comes only to those who have traveled the full journey from light into darkness and finally learned to see clearly what they had lost along the way.